Good evening. I'm David Levine. My guest tonight is Nancy Segal, and she will talk about her new book, Deliberately Divided, Inside the Controversial Study of Twins and Triplets Adopted Apart. Could you hold up the cover of the book? The book
Sure
is being,
can, David.
the book has not been published yet. The book is being published, will be published November
8th.
8th, okay? And the book reveals the inside stories of the agency that separated the twins and the collaborating psychiatrists who, along with their colleagues, observed the twins until they turned 12. Many people are more familiar with this story if they saw Three Identical Strangers. and also there's a movie called The Twinning Reaction, which I have not seen. And that told the story. So Nancy is a professor of psychology at California State University in Fullerton and director of the twin studies there, which she founded in 1991. She has authored approximately 200 scientific articles and book chapters, as well as 6 books about twins and twins research. And she's a twin herself, but a paternal twin. So I read the book. I really enjoyed it. Why don't you tell I'm going to let you open up. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them. So why don't you tell the story of the agency involved and also why the records are sealed until 2060, 65?
2065, David. Yeah.
No.
Well, let me first begin by just saying how I learned about this study, because it essentially ended in about 1980. And so when I was a new postdoc at the University of Minnesota, I arrived and everybody was talking about this study that CBS 60 Minutes was about to expose. And it was the Louise Wise Agency collaborative work with the Child Development Center of the Jewish Board of Guardians. And it was a study that secretly separated twins, and they were studied up until the time that they were 12. Now, the parents, the adoptive parents of these children, were told only that their child was in a developmental study, and there was an understanding that if they were to accept this child, they would be visited in their home from time to time for developmental reasons. And the parents thought that was wonderful. These are parents desperate to have children. So they had no idea that they were a twin. And some of these twins learned about it purely through accident. For people who saw Three Identical Strangers, you'll know that one of the triplets was confused for another one when he went to a small community college in upstate New York. And that's essentially how some of the other twins found out as well. They were confused for other people. So this study went on until the children were about 12, but it became extremely controversial. There was another attempt by 60 Minutes to expose what had been happening. And eventually the study stopped. Now, the data have been collected on approximately 5 sets of identical twins and 1 set of identical triplets, although I know of 3 or 4 fraternal twin pairs who were separated but not studied. And that's really bad science, because fraternal twins are the perfect control group for identical twins. So we can talk more about why that is a little later. But at any rate, the data were controversial, and they were placed in the Yale University archives with the idea that they were not to be open to anyone until the year 2065. The investigators felt that that was to protect the twins. My sense is that it was done to protect the investigators. So, but the problem is that many of the twins are eager to get the material. Some have been successful at getting some of it, but it's been heavily redacted. I guess the really difficult and upsetting part of it, David, is that in 2065, anybody can look at these data, and the twins will probably not be with us in those years, and many of them will have never seen the data records that I think rightfully belong to them.
Okay, so I had a few questions. First of all, tell me why they decided to do this experiment. I understand. I mean, they said they they thought, why would they think that it's better that twins be raised separately?
Okay.
And then the other part of the question is, why didn't the parents know that they were adopting a twin?
Okay. So your first question, why were twins separated? Was a psychiatric consultant named Dr. Viola Bernard, who was a psychiatrist, the psychoanalytic orientation at Columbia University. She was hired as a consultant to the Louise Wise Agency, and she was of the belief that twins should be separated at birth because they did not grow up with a sense of identity. So she felt that this would help them to grow up with a sense of who they were. And should they meet as adults, they'd be much better off to manage the relationship. She also believed that parental overburdening would be avoided if parents accepted only one child at a time. So that was her justification. And she said that there was evidence in the child development literature to support that. We can talk about whether there really was evidence or not, because I've never found it. And then your other question was what, David, now?
The other question was, why didn't they tell the other parents that there was a twin? And also, they were all placed with families that had an older sibling.
Correct. So they placed the children with families who had already adopted a child about 3 years older than the twins. Now, that was not hard and fast with fraternals who were not studied, but it was a rule of the identicals to make the situations a little more comparable. The reason they placed them with older children was that they did not want the twins to be only children, but in point of fact, they weren't only children to begin with. So it's kind of an ironic twist to that circumstance. They did not want the parents to know that they were raising a twin child because they felt that the parents would then reach out to the other families and they'd want the twins to meet. If the twins liked each other, that would ruin the experiment. So that was the reason for that. And in fact, as I describe in the book in a really riveting section, a pair of twins did meet. Well, they didn't meet, but one was confused for the other when the kids were about 6. And it eventually came to light that these were twins, and Viola Bernard counseled both families not to tell the children that they were twins. Now, they were dropped from the study at that point, although data had been collected on them for up to about 6 or 7 years. But the parents were then given this horrendous burden of knowing that their child had an identical twin out there in the New York City area, and they were not allowed to disclose this information to them. Eventually, these twins did meet because somebody else, when they were 17 years old, somebody else confused one for the other, and that led to a reunion. But it was a shock, and it really did some damage to family dynamics at that stage, because how can children then test a parent who kept such an important piece of information hidden from them for so many years?
And another question I have is that you said that the twins have in common, okay, identical twins have in common some traits. One of them is they often choose the same occupation. They often have the same dietary preferences. And, but you said that how similar their spouses are have not been studied. And also there were, in the case of the 3 boys, Bob, David, and Eddie, they also had some mental illness struggles.
Well, first of all, let's talk about twin similarities and how we assign causation to that. And so the classic twin method is very simple and very elegant. You simply compare the similarities of identical twins who share all their genes in common to how similar fraternal twins are, and they share half their genes uncommon on average by descent, just like ordinary brothers and sisters do. If the identical twins are more alike in intelligence, personality traits, interests, hobbies, abilities, this tells us that the genes do play some role in the development of that trait. Now, genes do not count for everything. No identical twins are exactly the same in any way, but we're learning that genetic influence is far more pervasive, affects many more traits than we ever would have imagined. Now, some challenges that have been raised regarding the twin method is that identical twins might be imitating one another. So that's where twins raised apart become such an important control group here. Because if identical twins who grow up in separate environments, separate communities, separate families show similarities, then you can't assign the causation to the environment. It must be something in their genes. Now, there's no gene for intelligence, a gene for a certain ability. Rather, we expect that these kinds of complex traits are influenced by many, many genes in our genome. And what we believe happens is that identical twins then will select from the array of opportunities in their environment the things that are most compatible with who they are. And that's what all of us do. All of us have a lot of opportunities. We could have maybe been a professor, a doctor, an attorney, but there are certain things that we like, that we're better at. And so we fashion our environments. Our environments really don't fashion us unless they're so overwhelming and dire and abusive that they overwhelm normal human development.
So in the New York Times article I did, where you're the expert I quoted, we talked about a person who, Francois Brunel, who had photographs of people who looked alike, but looked exactly alike in many cases, but they were not related. And they didn't have many things in common at all.
Correct. Now, I love that study. I love it because it's simple and yet very powerful. What David is talking about here is Francois Brunel, a photographer in Canada, who had a hobby of collecting photographs of people who looked alike, but were genetically unrelated. And some of them looked remarkably alike. And so I thought to use these cases in a way to challenge a common criticism against twin research, which is that twins' personalities are similar because people treat them alike based on their appearance. Now, I always thought that was silly. Personality is not in your face, it's in your brain. But nevertheless, if these unrelated lookalikes were similar in personality, then that criticism might be true. But if they were not, then it would suggest that something else is going on. So I was able to give them a very comprehensive personality battery. We replicated it later with a different personality battery, and we got average correlations of close to 0. So these unrelated lookalikes were not anywhere near alike. And I don't know how else to explain it without reference to genetics, because here you've got people sharing an environment, and yet identical twins raised apart are so much more alike. Even fraternal twins raised apart are more alike than unrelated people raised together. So the idea that people may treat identical twins alike, I don't disagree with that, but what is prompting that? It's that twins evoke similar treatment from those people around them. And that's what all of us do. You're treated a certain way because you evoke certain responses from your caretakers, your friends, your acquaintances, your coworkers.
Well, the people who proposed the theory that lookalikes would be similar was that they said, well, if 2 men look like George Clooney, and 2 women look like Julia Roberts, they'd probably be treated nicely and they'd probably be desired and all these things. And, and that was part of their rationale that, they would be chosen for the school play, they'd have a lot of friends, and that was the rationale.
Well, I'm willing to bet you, David, that maybe at first they'd be treated a little bit more alike, but they wouldn't have the behavior to sustain that. And if somebody cast a Julia lookalike in a leading role, that person may have absolutely no acting talent.
Right. Yeah. The other thing that, in the movie 3 Identical Strangers, they talk about that people look at twins and the similarities, but what they don't look at, and they focus on that immediately, like, because they were on television shows, and they were on, and they talked about how they liked the same food, they dressed alike, their hair was alike, but no one looked at the differences.
Well, that's not really quite true. When I was at the University of Minnesota, study of twins raised apart, I worked on that for 9 years. And we actually studied the triplets there too, as well as 137 identical and fraternal twins raised apart. And we were very interested in the differences. In fact, the similarities are kind of expected, I think. It's the differences that surprise us. And the triplets were different too. One was left-handed, 2 of them were right-handed. One of them was considered the intelligent one, and one considered more of the social one, and one considered more of a managing type. So there were differences between them, which of course eventuates when you've got similar genotypes together. You can't have a leader in every situation. And in my experience, when I study twins raised together and I see them together, one is always a little more assertive than the other one. And yet, then when I see them apart, it's almost like they're more alike because they're then free from the constraining influence of the other one. But
Well,
the differences are enormously interesting and important, particularly in the area of medicine, because it may surprise your listeners to know that if you think about a disease like diabetes or multiple sclerosis, the similarity rate for identical twins is only about 50%. And it should be 100% if they share all their genes. So what this means is that something in the environment is triggering the predisposition in one of those twins and not in the other. So if we can figure out what that is, then we could perhaps manage those kinds of conditions much better in the general population. So the message here is that twins are not just, I mean, twin research is not just for twins, it's a model for understanding human behavior and disease in general.
well, I know in schizophrenia that if one twin has schizophrenia, the other twin risk is much higher than the general population.
Of course it is. It's about 40, 50%, but it's not 100%.
Okay.
Genes predispose. Genetic influence is probabilistic. It is not deterministic.
Okay. What I was referring to is that for people who meet the twins or triplets, the first thing they notice is the similarities. They're not looking for the differences.
Well,
they're saying, oh my God, they're dressed alike. Oh my God, they both want mushrooms on their pizza.
well, I think it's both ways. I think that people look for both, and I know that when identical twins meet for the first time, they also look for similarities, but they also look for differences. And in fact, it was so interesting, David, when the identical twins would meet, sometimes for the first time at the University of Minnesota, some of them would be a little hesitant, they told us, about losing their identity or feeling like they weren't an individual. But they learned quite quickly that they were, because there were some fine differences between the twins. I remember one set of identical twins who looked remarkably alike, and yet one of them had a space between her teeth because she hadn't had orthodontia. So they were easy to tell apart. So, you know, one is usually a little more outgoing. We found if one was married and one wasn't, the married one usually dressed a little bit less fancy than the one who wasn't married. So you do see these fine differences. But I think the important point here too is that identical twins, while it's not perfect similarity, are more alike than any other pair of people. And we found that too. You know, I found that in my interviews with the twins who participated in the Neubauer study. I remember going to visit one twin in Queens, and she immediately wanted to go to a Greek restaurant because she loved Greek food. And then 2 days later, I met her twin sister in New Jersey, and she wanted to go to a Greek restaurant because she loved Greek food. So these are the kind of things that you see. And as much as I see them, I find them absolutely fascinating.
So let's talk about the experiment a little bit, because this experiment was, you know, you said it ended in 1980, but there's no research been published.
There have been a couple of case studies done, but a lot of them are quite repetitive, and I go into that in the book a lot.
Right.
There have probably been maybe 3 to 4 case studies, also published in rather remote locations. Not
but there's been no major like article in JAMA or anything
no,
like that.
no, not in the mainstream psychological literature. And then there was a book that was published entitled Nature's Thumbprint that came out in 1990. And I've read that book several times. And in it, there are little anecdotes published about some of the twins they studied, but also little anecdotes about some of the twins that we studied and some of the twins that were studied in 1937 in the US and in 1965 in Denmark and in 1962 in Great Britain. And the distinction between who studied these twins is often not made, you see. So I happen to know who those other twins were, but to somebody unfamiliar with the field, these things were not well cited. And the case studies are enormously interesting, but see, the reason that these investigators were so excited about doing this study was they thought that they were going to be able to derive the definitive answer on nature-nurture questions. And they believed they could do that because they were studying twins who were separated from birth, and they were tracking them from a very, very early age, whereas the previous reared apart twin studies always studied reunited twins in adulthood. So they couldn't, so we had to sort of recollect or reconstruct their past. But they believed this was going to be the definitive answer. But yet the sample was extremely small. Much, I mean, you can't make much from 5 twin pairs and 1 triplet set. That's 13 children, or well, that's 15 children, but no, it's 13 children, that's right. And actually, one of the twins was dropped early on from the study for various reasons. So really, the study has told us nothing. And I think that even if we were to get access to the treasure trove of data, which I know is at Yale, I'm not sure what it would tell us anything new. I think that the studies designed today are much more sophisticated with larger numbers. And I think that there's really nothing that we would learn. We might just learn the same thing, but in a different way.
Yes, I was surprised that the numbers are, I think the numbers actually evaluated over 11 people.
Yeah, well, it was 11 people because it was 4 twin sets, that's 8, plus 3 triplets is 11. But it was one twin set that was studied for a very, very short time. What happened was that they were adopted out at very different times and their birth weight was enormously different. So Dr. Neubauer, who was the collaborator of Dr. Bernard, I mentioned him earlier, he was the head of the Child Development Center in New York. So they decided to drop this pair. Now, that's very bad science. You don't drop a pair for those reasons. You keep them in to see to what extent are they similar as well. Maybe different adoption dates and or different birth weights wouldn't have made any difference. So they lost a valuable piece of information from my perspective.
Now, the government was involved in this study. The National Institute of Mental Health supported it. The Centers for Disease Control was involved. What was the
CDC was not involved, but the National Institute of Mental Health, you're correct. That did
I'm
give.
sorry, CDC Child Development Center.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah, the Child Development Center was involved. The NIMH did give them a grant, and that grant was awarded in 1965, I believe. And I have tried so hard to get the proposal. Of course, in those days, things were not digitized the way they are today. And I've tried so many numerous sources to try to get that. No one seems to have it. It is possible. It's hidden away at the Yale University archives, but we don't know that.
So do you consider this unethical, an unethical experiment?
Yes, I do. I do consider it unethical because the parents were not told the purpose of the study. They were told only that their children were to be in a developmental study of adopted children. And some parents were told different aspects of it. For example, one of the twins was placed in a family that actually had 2 older children. So they were told that the study was about adopting a child with 2 older siblings. So they had a slightly different version of why the study was taking place. Also, the families were not told this was a twin child. And I mean, that's a very important piece of your history. And I understand that in those days, in the 60s, there was not a lot of information about biological families given to adoptive families, but some things were. I mean, if the child had an allergy or needed a certain medication, that was told. And being a twin is enormously important information. And I'll tell you, one of the things that they never considered was that what if the child or the child as a teenager or adult needed an organ transplant? They've got the perfect donor just across town, and yet they would never have access to that. And in the book, I talk about a situation where 2 identical twin girls raised apart experienced seizures at about the same time, and they were treated differently by their physicians. Now, that's a very serious situation. What if one physician had absolutely no idea what was going on? The families and the physicians could both have benefited enormously from conversing with each other, but that would have ruined the idea of the way the study should have taken place.
So the people who, okay, Dr. Neubauer and the others, they're pretty prestigious people in the New York psychiatric community.
Oh, they certainly were. Dr. Neubauer and Dr. Bernard were very well known, not just in the professional world of psychiatry and psychoanalysis, but also in the social world. They had many friends, many contacts, very active. Yes, all of that. They were in a position to do so much good. And yet they really fractured the lives, not just of those twins and triplets, but of their families as well. Because the families are enormously affected. And the parents, I've spoken to a number of the parents, still bear anger toward this. These are parents who were fairly well off for the most part, and they would have welcomed multiple birth children into their home. In fact, some of the parents even requested twins and were told that there just weren't any.
Okay, so if people have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I do have a question that was emailed to me, so I'm going to read that. It says, I am seeing conflicting interpretations of the Minnesota transracial adoption study and the Minnesota transracial adoption study, the follow-up of IQ test performance at adolescence. What is the scientific consensus? And what are these studies?
Well, the Minnesota transracial adoption study was a study in which white families were adopting Black children to see if the IQs would be boosted. Now, let me talk more generally about adoption studies. What you do find from most adoption studies, if, say, a higher class family adopts a baby from a lower class biological family, it's that the IQ scores do go up. They do go up relative to, say, the siblings who remained in the biological home. But they tend to not rise as high as the biological children in those adoptive families. And I can speak to that more specifically in my study of what I call virtual twins. Virtual twins are same age, unrelated children raised together from birth. So they replicate twinship, but without the genetic link. And among these virtual twin families, I have now about 170 of them. So about a quarter of those are composed of a biological child in the family and an adoptee. And what I've been finding is that the adoptees do not score as well as the biological children do. And I suspect it's because of two things. They come from much more heterogeneous family backgrounds. And secondly, because adoptive families tend to be rather unique. They're unique in the sense that the parents tend to be older, financially well off, and in fairly good occupations, because remember, they have to be vetted by adoption agencies. So I think that is the reason. And that's a finding that I think is fairly pervasive across the adoption literature in the same racial adoptions as well as the transracial adoption studies.
So the other thing I'd like to discuss, which I should have been the first question, is we've been fascinated by twins. Shakespeare wrote about twins.
He was the father of twins.
He was the father of twins, yeah.
He had a male-female pair named Judith and Hamnet.
And my father there were twins in his high school who arranged their schedules so one would go one day, the other would go the other day. And people, I know the Bryan brothers are twins, and they asked them, "Did you ever like switch dates?" And they said they didn't really answer that question. But I think people are very fascinated by twins, and certainly the movie Three Identical Strangers really fascinated people. I think it also won awards.
Would you like to know why I think twins are fascinating?
Yes.
I thought that was where you were going with this anyway. But the reason I think twins are fascinating, of universal interest, is that we all grow up expecting and anticipating individual differences in behavior and appearance. And so when we encounter two people who look and act so much alike, it challenges our beliefs in the way that the world works. And we find it absolutely stunning that two people grow up in such matched ways. And you think about twins in the Olympics or in any kind of competitive sport where they end up being so similar in their scores and the points that they accrue. It just really amazes us. And the other aspect of it, David, is that we often look at identical twins and many of us envy their closeness, the effortlessness with which they develop their social bond and the closeness they have. And while some people might be jealous of this and some people might find it too restricting, I think everyone is fascinated and intrigued by it. I know that wherever I go and I mention that I study twins, people always have a twin story for me. It's inevitable.
Yes, I met one of the couples in the I'm Not a Lookalike were actual twin researchers in Scandinavia who were at a conference on twins. And someone went up to them and said, "I loved your lecture this morning." She said, "I didn't give a lecture this morning."
Yeah.
And yeah, and they discovered each other, and it was interesting to them, but they had absolutely nothing in common.
Yeah.
besides that.
Well, I think again that something that the Neubauer and Bernard study deprived the twins of was just enjoying this close relationship with one another. And, some of the twins told me that they felt a little awkward in college or a little shy. And if only they'd had a twin sister with them. Another pair, now these are fraternal twins. I was talking about identicals, but I'm moving to a pair of fraternals now. And in their chapter, I call them fraternal, almost identical, because they do look pretty much alike and they got along so beautifully. It was just remarkable. And when they first met, their meeting was actually videotaped by Tim Wardle, who directed Three Identical Strangers. He calls this little bit Two Identical Strangers. And I have the link to that in my book. It was published along with Atlantic Monthly magazine. But anyway, they said, "Hey, we got cheated out of twin popularity." And that may sound like something trivial, but I think it goes far deeper than that. They were cheated out of a very important foundational relationship. And I think that all of us, if we knew that we had a twin from whom we were separated as a very young infant, and we were just studied again without even knowing about our background, I think we'd all be bitter, angry, devastated, sad. I mean, the whole mix of emotions.
Do twins have their own language when they're young?
Well, twins raised together often do. I don't know if I'd call it a language, David. I would call it more a system or collection of private words, phrases, and gestures. And it's not particular to twins. Even near an age babies will develop this kind of thing. The danger in this is that it may somewhat delay twins' language development. And so when twins go to school, they may lag behind in their verbal skills. So I always advise parents to give the twins a little alone time with a parent with an older sibling, just so they can develop their language skills.
Okay, I do have a question. Can you discuss the potential role of epigenetics in twins research?
Oh, of course. That's a very hot topic today. So epigenetics refers to the turning on or turning off of genes, meaning that some genes will be expressed, others will not be. And this is where twin studies are so fascinating, because twins, as we said earlier, are not 100% concordant for various behaviors or various diseases. So if we can examine the epigenetic profiles of twins and determine which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off, this gives us a clue as to the underlying cause. Now, a very fascinating piece of research that was just published about a week or two ago showed that something in the division of that fertilized egg in the first 2 weeks leaves an epigenetic mark on the twin's genome. And what that means is that even if you were a twin raised apart or you lost your twin at birth, we can then look at your genes and know if you were born as an identical twin. I find that absolutely fascinating.
So you talk about in China, there are a lot of twins raised apart because they had a one-child policy.
Mm-hmm.
And where was the other child sent? And
Okay,
who decided that?
well, David, I'm conducting a study right now on Chinese twins adopted apart. And I'm doing it with the full consent and knowledge of the parents. Believe me, they come to me, I don't go to them. And what happened was that this policy that was enacted in 1979 and in place till 2015 restricted urban families to 1 child, rural families to 2, and very remote village families to 3. Now, China also values males. So families who had 1 child already and then gave birth to 2 girls often abandoned them. And there were thousands of baby girls abandoned, maybe hundreds of thousands, among them twins. Now, some of the twins were abandoned together and they were more likely to be adopted together. But I now have a sample of about 24 twins who were separated at birth because maybe parents kept one for a while and then gave it away, or they were placed in different orphanages or outside of different police stations. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I'm doing what Neubauer had hoped to do, which is to track development in real time. Now, I don't get the twins when they're born. I get them at about age 3, and some of them I didn't find till they were in their 20s. But nevertheless, I'm pushing the study ahead. I'm in touch with the children and with the parents on a periodic basis. Now, I only have 24 of these cases. I'm positive that there are others, and some of these parents discovered it only by accident. In fact, in one of the cases, the mother wanted to give her child a Christmas present of all her adoption materials. So she wrote back to the adoption agency in China to get these, and she was sent a photograph of a foster mother with 2 identical babies on her arm. And she recognized one as hers, but who was the other one? And that led to an absolutely amazing reunion.
So you've met the people, you met Robert Shafron and Bobby Kelman?
No, it's Bobby Shafron, David Kelman, and Eddie Galland.
All right, so you met, but you met Bob, David, and Eddie, but you met 2 of them, right?
I've met all 3 of them, actually.
All 3
I
of
met
them.
3 of them back in New York many years ago when we were thinking about doing a film on the triplets. That never came to pass, but there were some people interested at that particular time. And then I've stayed in touch with the other 2, mostly with Bobby over the years. And when I had my last book party in New York City, Bob and Dave showed up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not a secret, but one of them did commit suicide, unfortunately, in 1995.
That was Eddie.
That was Eddie. Yes, I know. What did you learn from meeting them in person that the film didn't tell us?
Well, I think that, I mean, I don't think I learned anything that the film didn't tell us. They were very close brothers. They loved each other a great deal. They were very, very hyperkinetic. I went to their restaurant once, the Triplets restaurant, which is no longer in business, and it was a wonderful, wonderful place. They had the perfect personalities to run it. But there were differences that actually came out, I think, in 3 Identical Strangers and in the twinning reaction. And it appeared that Eddie was the triplet who needed the social support of his brothers, I think, and the new triplet, the triplet set was more important to him, or more meaningful in his life. I can't say important, but more significant in his life than it was for the other 2. And one of the reasons may have been that Eddie did not feel a good fit in his family. His father was very highly disciplined. His father had been in the military and was a very highly disciplinary type of parent. Now, I don't blame the suicide on that. The triplets did have some psychopathology in their biological family, and all 3 admitted that they had had psychiatric spells in the hospital. But it could be the confluence of that in Eddie, plus the fact that one thing that held those triplets together, and I write about this in the book, David's father kind of adopted all 3 of them, and they loved him. And when he passed away, of course, it was a blow to all 3, but maybe an extra special blow to Eddie. And then when Robert left the restaurant to become a lawyer, and then Eddie and David were running it on their own, that might have been another blow to Eddie that perhaps he wasn't psychologically prepared to deal with. Remember, David, that when siblings grow up together, they learn to negotiate their difficulties. But if you don't have a shared social history, it's easier to walk away. I mean, I can have a fight with my sister and know that the next minute we're right there for her if an emergency happens. But maybe when you're raised apart, you don't have that kind of security. And I think that's what happened in this case.
Okay, and how do they get along with their siblings?
With their siblings?
No, I'm sorry. Each of them had
Oh.
this place in the family with a sibling.
Right. As far as I know, they got along just great with their siblings. In fact, Eddie, I think, had 2 sisters, one older, maybe one younger. Bobby had an older sibling, but I think a younger brother came to the family eventually. So yeah, as far as I know, they got along fine with their siblings. But you see, I've studied this long enough in all of the twins in the Neubauer study and the twins in Minnesota. And I can tell you that while many of these adopted siblings got along, they did not have the rapport that the twins raised apart felt when they met for the first time. It was like an instant connection. And Bob, Dave, and Eddie have said the same thing in many occasions. I studied a fascinating set from South America, from Colombia, South America, 2 sets of identical male twins born a day apart, one in Bogota, the lively capital city, and one in a remote village to the north called La Paz. And when one of the La Paz twins was very sick at 1 day of age, he was brought to the Better Hospital in Bogota for medical care. And he was accidentally switched with one of the other twins. So the result was two sets of unrelated brothers raised apart, right? But you had these copies of fraternal twins. They weren't really twins, but they thought they were raised in the same environment. And when I asked them, how did you get along with the brother you were raised with who was not related to you, as compared to the 25-year-old twin you just met? Well, they got along, they had brotherly loyalty, but they did not have the same attraction and rapport that they experienced with the identical twin whom they just met.
Okay, so I have several questions. Two are related. Do most twins suffer the same degree of mental health issues? The other question is, do most twins become as successful as each other, or does one twin seem to be more successful than the other?
When it comes to mental health issues, it's usually the case that both twins will have something, but it also depends on how you define concordance. I mean, there are twins where one is schizophrenic and the other one isn't. But if you define it as symptom pictures, severity, things like that, you will often find that there is concordance. If you do it as one has it, one doesn't, you might get a different picture. Now, your other question was, so you're asking me too many questions at once, David. It's hard to keep them all
Do
straight.
most twins become as successful as each other, or does one twin seem to be
Right.
more successful than the other?
For the most part, most identical twins are successful, many of them to the same degree, and many of them in the same profession. What a lot of them will do is take different sides of a profession. So I've met many identical twin artists where one is more applied and one is more of a historian, but they're equally happy and equally successful in their particular careers. Of course, there are exceptions where one twin does better than the other one. Of course, there are. But the story comes to us from many, not from the few. The few can teach us things, and we can then construct new studies to test new hypotheses. But the biggest message comes from what we learn from samples of twins and replicate the studies over time.
Well, I was kind of fascinated that you said Suzanne and Anne both married German engineers.
Yeah, that was really quite amazing. These were identical twins raised apart, and they both had married German engineers. And it's hard to know what that's all about. Maybe there was something about the mannerism that was particular to the culture, or something about the appearance, or something about an engineer. But we don't know. But the important thing is that studying identical twins raised apart in this way can give us new insights, new thoughts about the basis of mate selection.
So I was also very fascinated by, there's a city called Twinsburg, Ohio.
Yeah.
And they've been having a Twins Day festival. Is this true, since 1771?
No, that was when the city, I believe, was founded, and it wasn't even
Okay.
called Twinsburg for many years after that.
Okay.
The Twins Festival's been going on for a number of years, but certainly not before the 1900s.
Okay.
And it was formed by two identical twins. And then the city took it over, and they have an annual Twins Days festival that attracts hundreds, if not thousands, of twins from around the United States. I went there once, not as a twin, but as a researcher, and it was really quite amazing. I think that for research, it's ideal in the sense that you get numbers. It's not ideal in the sense that you get a self-selected group of twins who really identify as being identical. So as long as you have that caveat in mind, then research there is fine. I did do some research there, but I combined those cases with other ones that I got in more representative ways.
It sounds like a lot of fun.
It is a lot of fun. And what's interesting there too is that many identical twins are so close that they like to marry identical twins. And the reason is that everyone understands the importance of the relationship. So if you're an identical twin and you marry a non-twin spouse, that spouse might get jealous of the things that you share with your twin. It's almost like he or she is married to two people. And so some of the twins resolve it this way by marrying identical twins. Now, the fascinating thing about that too, and I have an earlier book called Indivisible by Two. And there I spent a couple of days with twins who married twins. They lived in Texas and they had adjoining houses with a common backyard. And yet I had always assumed that everybody was genetically interchangeable, could marry anyone, wouldn't matter. But they said absolutely not, that there were really real differences between them, that one twin was a little more outgoing, one twin was a little more submissive, so that the outgoing one married the submissive one and vice versa, or they'd be in conflict. I mean, it was a very interestingly constructed type of family. And it was just fascinating. And there have been more cases like that that I've said over the years. We call them quaternary families. And what's interesting there too is that the children from the two couples are genetically full siblings because they share half their genes on average. They essentially have genetically identical parents. So they're first cousins, culturally speaking, but they are full siblings genetically speaking.
Okay. Was the dishonesty at the base of the experiment in three identical strangers a symptom of the generally casual attitude towards honesty in the field of psychological experimentation? I've noted that psychological experiments frequently involve lying to the subjects of the experiments.
I don't understand that at all. Lying is not simply allowed in a psychological study.
Okay.
When you propose your study, it must be reviewed by the IRB, the Institutional Review Board of your university or institution, to make sure that people are informed as to what you're doing, that they have the freedom to withdraw from the study at any time with no prejudice on your part. Now, you don't necessarily have to tell people the hypotheses. You don't want to bias them to behave in a certain way, but you want to inform them about what the study's about in general and the kinds of activities they will be participating in and what some of the risks are.
So there were no consequences to the people who did this study.
There were really no consequences because IRBs were not in place in those years. Had IRBs been in place and the study been carefully vetted, I don't think it would have gotten through. But had they
What
said,
about lawsuits though from the families?
well, there were some lawsuits when the triplets met. And then what happened there was that the lawsuit never went forward because I was told that there were the law firms they contacted had clients who were hoping to adopt, and the law firm didn't want to jeopardize the opportunities of their clients from getting Louise Wise babies. Keep in mind that Louise Wise specialized in adopting Jewish babies out of Jewish families. And so if you were a Jewish family, that was the preeminent agency that you contacted. Now, there were no other lawsuits. There might have been some, as far as I know, but nothing has been settled. Right now, there are some lawyers who are trying to assist the twins in getting access to their records. And I should point out that from what I learned, there's a treasure trove of documents at Columbia University, some still under seal, but some not under seal when I went to look at that material in 2019. And there was definitely an indication that the researchers were very concerned about lawsuits coming up because they wondered, if we publish, will the families recognize each other, or will somebody recognize who this person is about? And so they were worried about themselves more than they were worried about the twins. And yet psychoanalysts publish detailed case histories all the time. If you read one, the detail is extraordinary. So that struck me as a little bit odd. There were also a lot of controversy, which I go through in the book, about the question, do we publish a book? And that's an enormously fascinating chapter.
Okay. So I just want to do a little plugging for upcoming events. Next Wednesday, October 20th, I'm interviewing Dr. Nipuni Rashabazi. She's a pediatric infectious disease physician at Mayo Clinic. She'll be talking about children in COVID-19, which I have not talked about before. On Tuesday, November 1st, I'm speaking to Susan Shapiro, who will tell you how to get published. She's helped many people get published. On Tuesday, November 9th, I'm speaking to Dr. Paul Offit, who's a vaccine expert who's on TV every day being interviewed. And he's going to speak about his new book, called You Bet Your Life, From Blood Transfusions to Mass Vaccination, the Long and Risky History of Medical Innovation. On Wednesday, November 17th, I'm speaking to Melinda Wenner-Moyer. Her book is called How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes, Science-Based Strategies for Better Parenting from Tots to Teens. And on Tuesday, November 30th, I'm speaking to Lena Zeldovich, author of The Other Dark Matter, The Science and Business of Turning Waste into Wealth and Health. So we've got quite a few things coming up. Next week, we'll be discussing children and COVID. If there are no more questions, I'm going to thank Nancy for her time. And what are you working on now besides the Chinese twins? And are you going to China?
No, these are all children who have been adopted in the US, Canada, some in Australia and England. And what I do is I send the parents packets of questionnaires, and now some of the twins are old enough to do them on their own. And then I hired local testers to give them general intelligence tests. And then I get the results. And I actually have a paper that was published a couple of months ago in the Journal of Experimental Child Psychology, where I compare the IQ similarity of the Chinese twins raised apart, Chinese twins raised together, who were also adopted, and the virtual twins. And fascinating set of findings. I'm looking now at the behavioral disorders in these kids. So I have a lot to look at. So I'm working on many twin studies. I have a study on the loss of a twin, comparing the loss to an identical versus fraternal, and the loss of a twin to anybody else in your family or in your social circle. I'm studying unrelated children, unrelated lookalikes. And actually, I was at a conference online the other day, and I was just amazed that one of the organizers looked exactly like one of my colleagues here at Cal State Fullerton. So they're in my study. You never know when you're going to find them. And I have studies on twin families, and this is quite fascinating. You know, I told you that if identical twins marry identical twins, the children are full siblings. But if identical twins marry unrelated people, their children are legal first cousins, but half siblings, genetically speaking. And so I have an ongoing study, as well as several publications that came out of it, looking at aunts and uncles and their closeness and investment in nieces and nephews. And I predicted, and what came to pass, is that identical twins feel much closer and more invested in their nieces and nephews, who are their genetic children, than do fraternal twins and their nieces and nephews, who are the ordinary garden variety aunt, niece, uncle, nephew type of relationship. So I have many studies going on. I have a website, which is drnancysegaltwins.org, and my studies are posted there.
Okay, there's one other question. Do you consider yourself both a scientist and an activist?
Well, I consider myself a scientist because I use twins in scientific ways to understand more about human behavior. I study twins for themselves. That's another aspect of twinship, because I'm interested in what school separation, how that affects twins and families. I'm interested in twin relationships and how we can improve those and make twin adjustment as positive as possible. When you say an activist, I go to bat for certain policies I believe in. I believe that all twins who are same sex should have DNA tests. I think that hospitals should provide these routinely, because I think that parents and twins need to know what kind of twin they are. This is very, very important with regard to identity and medical decisions. And I also am an activist when it comes to school separation. I am very disturbed that so many administrators, principals, teachers believe twins should automatically be separated because they won't be individuals otherwise. And there is no research to support that. In fact, it's just the other way around, particularly when children are young and going to school for the first time. And I should also point out that I work as a legal expert, consultant in twin cases involving wrongful death, injury, and also cases of cheating, where identical twins, in my view, have been wrongly accused of cheating because they come up with the same scores. And the literature supports that there's similar performance. And so I'm very disturbed that that takes place, and I will go to bat for those cases.
Okay, well, again, thank you very much. Why don't you show your book cover again?
I'd be happy to.
And where can people get this book? Or order it in advance?
Yeah, the book is available on Amazon. You can pre-order. It comes out in just a couple of weeks. It's available at Barnes & Noble and available from the publisher too. Roman and Littlefield is the publisher.
Okay, well, thank you for spending time with us. Good to see you again. And we haven't spoken in a couple of years.
Right, we haven't, David. We'll have to get along. We'll have to get together more often.
Okay, all right, take care and stay safe, everyone. And next Wednesday, I'll be discussing children and COVID with an expert from the Mayo Clinic.
Thanks a lot.
Good night.